Okay, problem of evil. Now, the problem of evil, you're mainly going to get questions on the actual theodicies, the answers, but you could technically get a question on the actual problem. So very basically, what you need to look at is called the inconsistent triad. The idea that you've got omnipotence and you've got omnibenevolence, and this is inconsistent with evil in the world. That's the inconsistent triad. If we had omnipotence and omnibenevolence, we would presume that the world was going to be perfect, but it's not. Now, Epicurus gives us a classical definition, which is either God cannot abolish evil or he will not. If he cannot, he's not all-powerful. If he will not, he's not all-loving. But it existed before Epicurus anyway. Now, the answers to it. Very obviously, we can answer it by simply removing one of the problems. One of the elements. So, saying evil doesn't exist, which is hard, but some people try to do. Saying God's not all-loving, which is a deistic answer. It's not a problem for them. Or that God's not all-powerful. There's just some things he can't do, which, again, people think it makes sense. But from a theistic point of view, it's still a problem. So we get the theodicy. Now, theodicy is not just an answer to the problem, it's an attempt to justify the righteousness of God in the face of evil. How can God be those things, but also still righteous? How can he be good? Now, we've got two types of theodicy, soul-making and soul-deciding. Now, the first one that we'll look at is Augustine, who gives us a soul-deciding theodicy. Now, this is based on the idea of free will. Ultimately, God is justified, firstly, because he did not create evil. Because evil is a privation. It is a lack of goodness. What God does create in Genesis is a perfect world. Genesis 1 it says, and it was good. He creates a perfect world, but in Genesis 2, at the end, in Genesis 3, he creates temptation, i.e. he creates free will, because he wants us to choose him. Now, because of this creation, what we got was original sin, because Adam and Eve fell, and before them, the angels fell, which is why we had temptation in the first place. This corrupted, perverted the world in which we live, and this specifically explains natural evil, because obviously moral evil is explained because God creates free will, and this is a good thing. We're quite glad. But that's why bad things can sometimes happen when people make bad choices. But the reason why earthquakes, volcanoes, and the rest of it happen is because this perfect world was corrupted. Now, getting back to the original sin, because we're all seminally present within Adam and Eve, that's why we share the guilt. We share the guilt of our original ancestors, and that's why we are suffering. So, why is it a theodicy? Well, we are justified because we will decide the fate of our soul. Because we're living in this God-forsaken evil world, we can ultimately choose God, and at the end of it, we will be saved. Because ultimately, God is giving us that free will choice. The soul-making theodicy is on the basis that, ultimately, we need evil. So, Irenaeus, who gives us this argument, unlike Augustine, says that God does create evil. Because this world is fit for purpose. Because its purpose is to be a soul-making world. And we require evil, because in the face of evil, pain and suffering, we mature, we develop. So, when we finally get the opportunity to go to the afterlife, we will ultimately be saved. Because going back to Genesis, he says that we are created in the likeness, in the image of God, but to grow in the content, to be more like God, we need to experience life. Adam and Eve were not mature. Adam and Eve showed that when they disobeyed God and they sinned. So free will has got another important part in that. So we require free will to make our free will choices and to experience the pain and the suffering and ultimately be saved. Now you also need to know about Hick, who reworked the Irenaean theodicy and ultimately quoted Keats by saying it was the veil of soul-making. And it's him who says that ultimately it's fit for purpose. If its purpose is to be soul-making, then the world truly is good. And God creates it in the full justification of that it's a necessary act. Now, criticisms of both. It requires a literal understanding of Genesis, which generally we don't accept. The soul-making theodicy is criticised because, well, firstly, Hicks suggests universal salvation. Well, what's the point in the test if everyone's going to pass? Secondly, how can someone say that they are maturing if they're suffering from a terminal illness? And it brings in the question about fairness. So, for instance, if somebody doesn't experience much suffering and someone experiences a hell of a lot of suffering, well, why is that fair? Why does someone require more than somebody else? Criticising of Augustine is mainly down to the literal nature of the literal interpretation of Genesis. Okay, any questions about the problem of evil?
What was the one about how is it a test that you can win like instantly pass?
The universal salvation. It's not about instantly, but it's the fact that he said that everyone's going to pass. So the only value in a test, going back to your exams, if you get an A, you know, it's only going to have value if there's some people who got lower than an A, isn't it? So what's the point in a test? Why didn't God just create us with the content if we're all going to pass anyway? Okay?
So what did we say about the types were corrupted by the angels? Is that right?
So basically, the original fall was the fall of the angels, which is why then there could be temptation in the Garden of Eden. But God created a perfect world, but when we sin and when the angels sin, that's when the world became corrupted. Okay, and end.